The unexpected assignment. The massive intergalactic warship Vanguard hummed softly as it cruised through the unknown reaches of deep space. Its sleek metallic hull glimmered under distant stars, cutting through the void like a knife through air. Inside, the crew was going about their usual routines, but there was an air of tension aboard the ship today. A mission was coming up, one that would push the crew to their limits, and the rumors about the assignment had been swirling for days. Engineer Jason Ward had just finished a long day in the ship's mechanical bay, ensuring the vital systems of the Vanguard were in top shape for the mission ahead. The hum of the ship's engines, the rhythmic beep of consoles, and the quiet whirring of machinery were the only sounds that kept him grounded. Ward was known for his quiet demeanor and his dedication to his craft. He didn't bother with distractions. He was the kind of man who kept to himself, often spending days alone in the lower levels, fixing and tuning systems that others barely understood. But today was different. As Ward walked down the dimly lit corridor leading to his quarters, his communicator buzzed sharply. He frowned, already feeling the weight of an incoming request. It was Captain Elena Darvok, the no-nonsense commander of the Vanguard, calling him to a private meeting. Engineer Ward, the captain's voice crackled through the speaker. Report to the briefing room immediately. There's been a change in your assignment. Prepare yourself. Ward raised an eyebrow. What kind of change could it be? He had already heard the rumors that the Vanguard was heading into a hostile territory. It was going to be a dangerous mission. But a change in his assignment, that was unusual. With a sigh, Ward made his way to the briefing room, his boots echoing in the empty hallways. The ship was always bustling, but in moments like these, the silence was palpable. When he reached the door to the briefing room, he stepped inside, expecting a few colleagues to be gathered for the mission debriefing. But when the door slid open, it was only Captain Darvok, standing beside a single chair. She didn't greet him with her usual firmness. Instead, her gaze was slightly softer, almost apologetic. "You're being reassigned," she said without preamble, "to a new task force. You're going to be sharing your quarters." Ward blinked, confused. Sharing my quarters? With whom? The captain hesitated before speaking. Lieutenant Lyra. She's from the Xelvian species. The name Xelvian sent a chill down his spine. The Xelvians were a well-known alien race, one of the most beautiful and mysterious species in the galaxy. They were known for their seductive allure, and Lyra had a reputation that matched her kind. As a Xelvian seductress, she wielded a dangerous power, one that made her both feared and revered. Stories circulated that Xelvians often used their charm to manipulate their surroundings. But what was she doing on the Vanguard? Ward's mind raced, his thoughts clouding with the implications. But why? Why am I being paired with her? Captain Darvok's face hardened. She's part of the new security initiative. We need you both in close proximity. It's a sensitive operation. Trust me, you'll be safer this way. Ward didn't fully understand, but there was no arguing with the captain. If she thought it was necessary, it had to be. He simply nodded, trying to suppress the unease creeping up his spine. Her quarters are located just a few doors down from yours. You'll need to report to her at 600 hours tomorrow for the mission briefing. The captain continued. Get some rest, engineer. This mission will require all your focus. As the captain dismissed him, Ward turned to leave, but before the door slid shut behind him, Captain Darvok's voice stopped him. "Oh, and Ward," she added, her tone serious, "don't let her charms distract you." He gave a single nod, unsure of how to respond. What did she mean by that? Was this more than just a professional assignment? Ward spent the next few hours in his quarters, sitting on his bed, staring out at the stars. He tried to push the thoughts of the mysterious Xelvian out of his mind, but they kept creeping in. Her beauty, her allure, the power she wielded without lifting a finger. But Ward was a man of discipline, and he had always kept his focus on his work. He was a mechanical genius, and the Vanguard depended on his skills. He couldn't afford to be distracted by a seductress. There were more important things at stake. When the morning came, Ward stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his uniform. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but he had no choice but to follow orders. He had never been one for uncertainty. He preferred the solid and the predictable, the hum of engines, the click of a well-oiled system, the certainty of his craft. The moment he stepped out into the hallway, however, the unexpected hit him like a wave. Standing there, at the threshold of the door to his new quarters, was Lieutenant Lyra. Her features were almost impossibly perfect. Her skin a smooth blend of pale silver and soft lavender. Her violet eyes glinting with curiosity as they met his. A silver band wrapped around her neck, a sign of her high status among her people. She was everything he had heard about and more. Mysterious, beautiful, and utterly captivating. And as their gazes locked, Ward felt a strange, unsettling sense that he had underestimated how deeply this mission would affect him. Lyra's voice was soft, smooth as velvet. "Engineer Ward," she said, her lips curling into a subtle smile. "I'm afraid we'll be spending quite a bit of time together." Ward's breath caught in his throat, but he quickly regained his composure. "Let's make the best of it, Lieutenant," he replied, keeping his tone professional. But as he stepped into the quarters, a part of him knew this mission would be anything but ordinary. The journey ahead was full of unknowns, and he was about to find out just how dangerous and thrilling it could be to share space with an alien seductress. The door slid shut behind him, sealing them both inside. And thus, the real adventure began. A difficult start. The first few hours in the cramped quarters were tense. The room, though functional and designed for 2 crew members, felt far too small for both a seasoned human engineer and a mysterious, beautiful alien seductress. It was a strange, uncomfortable proximity, one that neither of them seemed prepared for. Ward had done his best to focus on his work, his thoughts consumed by the technical challenges ahead. But every time he glanced toward Lyra, he couldn't help but notice her, standing there with a grace that almost seemed to defy the laws of physics. She moved fluidly, as though every motion was practiced and calculated. Her violet eyes never left him, studying him with a penetrating gaze. And yet, she said nothing. It was as if she was waiting for him to speak first. For all her allure, Lyra wasn't exactly making things easier. She was clearly the type to use her charm as a weapon, but Ward wasn't one to fall for it. He had been trained to stay focused, to think logically and analytically. He'd handled much worse than a seductive alien on a mission. The ship was more important than any distractions, and that's what he kept telling himself. But when Lyra finally spoke, her voice was like honey dripping from the edges of her lips. "I've been given a special assignment as well," she said casually, her tone smooth, almost seductive. She leaned against the wall, her posture relaxed but commanding. "I'm supposed to stay close to you. I have a feeling you're not exactly thrilled about that." Ward didn't flinch. "I'm here to do my job, Lieutenant," he replied, his voice steady. He looked down at his datapad, pretending to review a list of maintenance checks that needed to be done. Lyra took a few steps closer, but he didn't acknowledge her movement. She stopped just a few feet away, her scent subtle yet enticing. The air in the room felt heavier, charged with an energy he wasn't sure how to handle. Still, he remained focused on the task at hand. "Of course, you're here to work," she said, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "But I wonder, how long will you be able to resist me, Engineer? You can't deny what's right in front of you. You've heard the stories, I'm sure. The rumors about my kind." Ward's jaw tightened. "I've heard enough. But I'm not here to indulge your games, Lieutenant. I'm here to make sure this ship stays in one piece." Lyra smiled, almost as if she enjoyed his resistance. She crossed her arms over her chest, her gaze never leaving his face. "You misunderstand me," she said softly. "I'm not playing a game, Engineer. I'm simply stating facts. You've never met anyone like me. No one has." He remained silent, not wanting to give her the satisfaction of a response. The ship's internal communication system suddenly buzzed to life, cutting the tension in the room. Ward immediately turned to answer, eager for the distraction. "Ward, this is Captain Darvok. There's been a minor issue with the outer hull. We'll need you both to head to the engineering deck and check the seals. Lyra, your expertise in combat readiness will be useful there as well. Be quick." Ward didn't wait for a response. He grabbed his toolkit and headed toward the door. Lyra followed, her steps light and graceful as always, but there was something more in her eyes now. A challenge, a curiosity about him that he couldn't quite place. The engineering deck was bustling with activity as they arrived. Crew members worked frantically to fix minor damages from a recent skirmish with an unknown enemy vessel. Ward immediately got to work, checking the hull's integrity with his scanning tools. Lyra, on the other hand, appeared unfazed by the hectic environment. She moved with an easy confidence, standing just out of the way, watching Ward work. The engineer could feel her eyes on him, but he tried his best to ignore her. There were systems to repair, and he couldn't afford to be distracted. After a while, however, Ward realized that Lyra wasn't simply observing. She was studying him. Her gaze flicked between his hands and the tools he was using, then back to his face. It was subtle, but there was an undeniable intensity in the way she analyzed every movement. She was trying to figure him out, trying to break through his defenses. "Does this seem off to you?" Lyra asked, her voice low and unassuming, though there was an edge to it. Ward glanced up at her, his brow furrowing. She had a sharp eye for detail. Something about her was more than just charm. "What do you mean?" She stepped closer, glancing at a nearby console that displayed the integrity readings for the ship's outer hull. "The readings are fluctuating. It's not just a minor issue. Someone's tampered with the systems." Ward's eyes narrowed. He knew something had felt off about the mission, but he hadn't been able to put his finger on it. Now, here was Lyra, pointing out something he might have missed. She was good. He had to give her that. He scanned the console again, running a series of checks. His fingers flew over the buttons, recalibrating the system to get more accurate readings. As he did, the truth became clear. Someone had deliberately sabotaged the ship's outer seals. Ward cursed under his breath. "Someone's trying to take us down." Lyra's expression didn't change, but there was a glint of approval in her eyes. "I told you. I can see things others can't. And this is just the beginning." Ward felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had no choice but to trust her now. Whether he liked it or not, they were in this together. And as much as he wanted to keep his distance from her, there was something about Lyra that made it impossible to ignore her. She was as sharp as she was dangerous, and it seemed like their missions had just begun. But there was still the nagging question in his mind. Why had he been paired with her in the first place? And what other surprises awaited them in the heart of space? Their uneasy partnership had just begun, and neither knew yet how far it would take them. Secrets unravel. The Vanguard moved steadily through the cold expanse of space, its powerful engines humming with the promise of unknown adventures. In the sterile hallways, only the quiet hum of the ship's systems and the occasional voice over the comms broke the silence. Ward's mind was still spinning with the realization that the sabotage they had uncovered was only the tip of the iceberg. He wasn't sure if he could trust Lieutenant Lyra completely, but the situation had become far more dangerous than he ever expected. Their uneasy partnership continued, and the two were now spending more and more time together. Every day, they worked on various maintenance tasks, fixing broken systems, patching up the ship's defenses, and investigating any remaining issues with the outer hull. Despite Ward's best efforts to remain focused on the job at hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play. Something bigger and far more dangerous than either of them could understand. As the days passed, Ward couldn't help but notice something strange about Lyra. At first, he thought it was just her enigmatic nature or the way she seemed to be always watching him. But the more time they spent together, the clearer it became. Lyra was hiding something. One night, as they worked side by side in the lower engineering bay, Ward looked over at her, watching her concentrate on recalibrating a malfunctioning energy converter. She was calm, almost too calm, as if nothing in the galaxy could disturb her. But he had seen something in her eyes earlier, something fleeting. Was it fear, regret, or was it something else altogether? He couldn't tell, and it bothered him. "You're awfully quiet tonight, Lieutenant," he remarked, breaking the silence. "Is something bothering you?" Lyra didn't look up from the task she was focused on. Her voice, however, was sharp. "I'm fine, Engineer, just focusing on the task at hand." Ward didn't believe her. There was something in her tone, something guarded. He was a skilled engineer, but he was also an excellent judge of character. His training had taught him that, and he had learned to trust his instincts. "Something's not right," he muttered to himself, staring at the schematics of the ship's systems. "This sabotage, it's too clean, too deliberate." Lyra's expression changed for a moment. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but he saw it. The way her lips tightened, the brief flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the calm, unflappable exterior that she wore so well. "You're right," she said, after a beat. "It's not just some random malfunction. This isn't the work of a novice. Whoever's behind this knows exactly what they're doing." Ward stood up and paced around the cramped bay. The entire situation was escalating faster than he had anticipated. The sabotage, the strange disturbances, and the odd feelings he was getting from Lyra. It was all starting to feel like a dangerous game, one where the stakes were much higher than he realized. "So, who's behind it?" he asked, his voice low. "Who would want to destroy this ship?" Lyra paused her work and finally looked him in the eye. For a moment, Ward thought she was going to say something important, something that would change everything. But then she looked away, back to her work. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I have an idea of who might be involved. And I don't think we're the only ones in danger." Ward's pulse quickened. He had been waiting for her to say something, anything, that would help him make sense of the chaos unfolding around them. But now, he wasn't sure whether he could trust her anymore. Was she hiding more than just her own secrets? "Who are you talking about?" he asked, stepping closer to her. "Do you know something you're not telling me?" Lyra's violet eyes flashed as she straightened, meeting his gaze for the first time without hesitation. She opened her mouth to respond, but just as she did, an alarm suddenly blared across the ship. "Intruder alert." The ship's automated voice echoed through the corridors. Ward's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected it to escalate so quickly. The ship was under attack. "Stay here," he commanded, instinctively reaching for his communicator. Lyra didn't move. "No," she said firmly. "We need to go now. I've been trained for situations like this." She was already heading toward the door before Ward could respond. There was no time for argument. The two rushed through the ship's hallways, which were now flooded with flashing red lights and the sound of alarms. Crew members hurried in every direction, securing equipment and preparing for battle. Ward's mind raced as they moved toward the command center. Whoever was behind this attack had infiltrated the Vanguard, and it seemed like they were ready to take it down. As they reached the command center, Ward's eyes widened at what he saw. The security team had already engaged with enemy forces. Multiple hostile ships had appeared out of nowhere, their dark silhouettes casting an ominous shadow over the Vanguard's hull. The enemy wasn't just a pirate faction or a rogue fleet. No, this was something much more organized. Lyra's voice cut through his thoughts. This wasn't a random attack. Whoever's behind this knew exactly when and where to strike. Ward turned to her, his mind spinning. But why would they sabotage their own ship just to stage an attack? What's the real objective here? For the first time, Lyra hesitated. It was brief, just a flicker of uncertainty, but Ward caught it. Whatever she knew, she wasn't ready to share it with him. Not yet. Before he could press her further, a massive explosion rocked the ship, sending everyone stumbling. The force of it was so intense that the lights flickered out for a moment, plunging the command center into darkness. When they came back on, the view screen was filled with an eerie image. A strange, unfamiliar vessel appeared on the far side of the ship. It was massive, far larger than anything they had encountered before. "This is not good," Ward muttered under his breath. Lara stepped closer to the console, her fingers flying over the keys, her eyes scanning the ship's systems with frightening speed. "We're going to need to work together if we want to survive this," she said quietly. Ward looked at her, realizing that whatever secret she had been hiding were far more dangerous than he had imagined. And the true test of their partnership was only just beginning. The betrayal. The Vanguard shook violently as enemy ships continued their assault. The blast doors were sealed, but the tension on board was palpable. In the command center, Ward and Lyra stood side by side, working furiously to stabilize the ship's systems. Crew members scrambled to manage the damage, but it was clear that their attackers were no ordinary enemies. Whoever was behind this had planned every move meticulously, almost as though they had known the Vanguard's every weakness. Ward's mind raced. How could someone have infiltrated the ship so easily? The sabotage, the mysterious attack, and now the growing suspicion that something much deeper was happening aboard the ship. And then there was Lyra. He couldn't help but feel that she knew more than she was letting on. She had been too calm, too controlled during the chaos, and it wasn't just the work of a well-trained officer. It was the work of someone with intimate knowledge of the ship and its systems. "Where are the enemy ships?" Ward asked, turning to Lyra. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. Lyra glanced at the holographic display in front of them. "There are 3 ships surrounding us. They've disabled our main engines and weapon systems. We're sitting ducks." Ward clenched his fists. "What do you suggest we do? We can't just sit here." Lyra didn't answer immediately. Her fingers moved over the controls with deliberate precision, her expression unreadable. Ward had learned that her calm was never an indication of her lack of focus. Quite the opposite. But now, something was off. He noticed a slight hesitation in her movements, a brief pause before she initiated the next command. "Lyra," Ward said, his voice low, "what are you not telling me?" She froze, her eyes flicking up to meet his. There was a flicker of something. Was it guilt? Or perhaps fear? For just a moment, her carefully composed exterior cracked. "You think I'm hiding something," she said, her voice softer than usual. "You're right." Ward's heart raced. "What are you talking about?" Lyra took a deep breath, her gaze shifting toward the command center's large view screen. "I never told you the full story about why I'm here. You see, I'm not just a simple liaison or a member of this ship's security. My true mission is, well, it's a lot more complicated than that." Before Ward could respond, a loud crash echoed from down the hallway. The door to the command center burst open, and a group of armed soldiers rushed in, weapons raised. Their uniforms were standard military, but Ward immediately noticed something strange. Their insignia was wrong. This wasn't Vanguard's crew. "You've been compromised," one of the soldiers barked, pointing his weapon at Lyra. Ward stepped forward instinctively, placing himself between her and the armed soldiers. "What is this? Who are you?" he demanded, his mind spinning. Lyra remained calm, though her eyes betrayed her inner tension. "This isn't what you think, Ward. I wasn't sent here by the Vanguard Command." The soldiers didn't seem to be in the mood for explanations. They advanced, and Lyra didn't flinch. With a sudden, swift movement, she disarmed one of the soldiers, grabbing his blaster and using it to neutralize the rest in a few quick, fluid motions. Ward stood frozen, eyes wide with shock. He had never seen her move like that. Her actions were sharp, decisive, and deadly. Lyra looked back at him, her face a mask of calm. "I didn't want you to know this yet, but you have to understand. I'm not who I said I was. The truth is, I was sent here to sabotage this mission." Ward felt the floor drop out from under him. The ship's alarms blared louder, the vibrations from enemy fire intensifying, but everything seemed to slow down. The betrayal stung more than he expected. "I don't understand." "Why?" he whispered, his voice full of disbelief. Lyra stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. "It's complicated. My orders were clear. The Vanguard's mission was a threat to certain powerful factions in the galaxy, factions who would do anything to stop it. I was sent to make sure it failed. But what I didn't expect—" Her voice trailed off, her expression softening. "What I didn't expect was you." Ward's mind whirled, his thoughts fighting for clarity. So everything, the sabotage, the attacks, the secrecy, it was all a setup. "You were playing me the whole time." Lyra nodded, her gaze never wavering. "I had no choice. I had a mission, and I followed it to the letter. But now things have changed." She took a deep breath, her voice lowering. "I'm not sure I can finish this job. Not after everything we've been through together." Ward didn't know how to react. Everything he thought he knew was a lie. The woman standing before him, the one who had seemed like nothing more than a flirtatious alien soldier, had been sent here to destroy the very ship he'd sworn to protect. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming. The realization hit him hard. There was a larger plot at play, something far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. The enemy didn't just want to take down the Vanguard. They wanted to use it to spark something much bigger, something that could change the entire balance of power in the galaxy. "We have to stop this," Ward said, his voice finally breaking through the fog of betrayal. "If what you're saying is true, then we've been manipulated from the start. The sabotage, the attack, it's just a distraction." Lyra's eyes darkened. "Exactly. The real target is much closer than you think." Suddenly, the ship's voice rang out again. "All hands, prepare for emergency evacuation. Hull breach in Sector 7. Full breach imminent." Ward's heart raced. "Where's the breach?" Lyra moved quickly, scanning a nearby terminal. "Sector 7, right under the main reactor core. If that area goes down, we'll lose everything." Ward's jaw tightened. The reactor core was the heart of the Vanguard, and if it was compromised, there would be no escaping the disaster. "Let's go," Ward ordered, his mind now fully in mission mode. There was no time to waste. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. As they rushed toward the breach point, Ward couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. Lyra's betrayal still stung, but there was no time to process it. They had one shot at stopping whatever had been set in motion. And for the first time since meeting her, Ward wasn't sure if he could trust the woman beside him, or if she was now the only one who could help him save the ship. Bond of survival. The Vanguard groaned under the strain of the attack. The halls were filled with the constant thrum of alarms and the scent of ozone from the damaged systems. Ward and Lyra sprinted down the corridors, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. The whole ship seemed to be falling apart around them, and they had no time to waste. "We have to get to Sector 7 now." Ward shouted over the loud alarms, his voice barely cutting through the chaos. Lyra's eyes were sharp, focused on the mission. She was moving with the ease of someone who had lived through battle, her every step measured and purposeful. Despite the distrust, despite everything, Ward couldn't deny that she was good. No, she was exceptional at what she did. "Stay close," Lyra said, glancing at him. She led the way, moving swiftly down the narrow passageways, navigating with ease through the burning wreckage that was starting to show up as they got closer to Sector 7. Ward followed closely, trying to keep up. He could hear the pounding of his own heart in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Part of him still wanted to question everything Lyra had told him, to demand answers for all the lies. But right now, that wasn't the most important thing. The reactor was in danger. If they didn't stop the breach, the entire ship would be gone. They would all be dead. When they reached Sector 7, the door was locked, the security protocols flashing red. Ward's fingers moved quickly over the keypad, accessing the emergency override. He didn't wait for Lyra's approval. This was his area, his expertise. The door hissed open. Inside, the damage was severe. The main reactor's core was exposed, a flickering light in the center of the chamber, with the surrounding walls cracked and sparking. The breach had begun, and it was only a matter of time before the whole ship would be rendered uninhabitable. "We don't have much time," Ward muttered, kneeling next to the reactor core's exposed wires. His fingers flew over the control panel, trying to stabilize the core long enough to prevent a catastrophic meltdown. Lyra, meanwhile, was already securing the room, her movements swift as she scanned the perimeter. Her eyes never stopped moving, as if she expected an ambush at any moment. Ward could feel the pressure building. The task ahead of him was daunting, but it was the only chance they had. Every second counted. He focused on the task, using every bit of his engineering knowledge to reroute power, patch up the core's exposed systems, and stabilize the readings. "We're running out of time," Lyra called from across the room. "If that core goes critical, we won't just lose the Vanguard. We'll lose everything." Ward didn't need to be reminded. His hands worked faster, his mind sharp despite the stress. He could hear Lyra moving behind him, her presence an odd comfort amidst the chaos. Then the ship shook again, this time harder. The lights flickered and the walls rattled as another explosion went off somewhere deep within the ship. Ward's heart sank. The enemies weren't just attacking. They were systematically tearing the ship apart, hitting the vital systems one by one. "I'm almost there," Ward shouted, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. The reactor's core was stabilizing, but the damage was extensive. The sabotage had been designed to cripple the ship from the inside out. He had to get the power back on, quickly. Lyra suddenly stopped. Ward looked up, noticing that her attention had shifted, her body tensing. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. Lyra's eyes narrowed. "We're not alone." Before Ward could react, the door to the reactor chamber slammed shut with a heavy thud. The emergency lockdown had engaged. The lights turned red, and the ship's intercom system blared another warning. "Intruder alert. All personnel are advised to evacuate." Ward's pulse quickened. He was trapped with Lyra in the reactor chamber, and now they had more problems than just the failing systems. There was someone, or something, else aboard, and they were here for one reason: to ensure that the mission failed. Lyra's posture shifted, ready for a fight. Her hand hovered near her side, where a blaster was holstered, but she didn't draw it. Instead, she turned to Ward, her expression darkening. "You should go," she said quietly, her voice sharp. "You're the only one who can fix this. I'll hold them off." Ward stared at her, confused and unsettled. "Hold them off? What are you talking about? We need to work together." Lyra shook her head. "You're right, but I'm not giving them the chance to get to you. If they find you, the ship is lost." Ward's throat tightened. He wasn't sure what had happened between them, but in that moment, he realized just how much they had both changed over the course of this mission. Their differences were vast. Their trust had been shaken, but somewhere in the chaos, they had formed a bond, one he wasn't willing to break. "No," he said firmly, "I'm not leaving you." Before they could say more, the door exploded open, and several armed soldiers, masked and armored, burst into the room. Lyra was already in motion, diving into a defensive position as she unleashed a barrage of fire. The sound of blaster shots filled the chamber, and Ward ducked instinctively, even though he wasn't the target. He couldn't just stand there. He grabbed the nearest weapon, a plasma rifle, and joined the fight, firing at the intruders who were closing in on their position. He wasn't an expert in combat, but he had enough training to know how to protect himself. And right now, survival was the only priority. Lyra was a whirlwind of movement, her grace and precision unmatched. Ward could see it now, the depth of her skills. She wasn't just a seductress, she was a warrior, trained for situations like this. They fought together, side by side, as the intruders pushed forward. Every shot, every movement was calculated. They were working as a team, and for the first time, Ward realized that he could rely on her. He didn't fully understand the complexity of her past, the betrayal she had confessed. But in that moment, none of it mattered. They had a common goal, survival, and nothing else was more important. Eventually, the last of the attackers fell, and the reactor room fell into a tense silence. Ward was panting, covered in sweat and dust, but alive. They had won for now. Lyra, however, seemed unaffected by the battle. She straightened, her breathing steady, her expression calm. She turned to Ward with a nod. "We need to finish what we started," she said. Ward looked at her, the weight of everything finally hitting him. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "Let's do this." They turned back to the reactor, knowing that their mission was far from over. But now, at least they weren't alone in this fight. Together, they could face whatever came next. The final showdown. The Vanguard continued to shudder under the assault. The blast doors had sealed, but the hull still groaned as explosions rocked the ship. Ward and Lyra stood in the heart of the reactor chamber, sweat and grime on their faces, the faintest trace of victory still lingering in the air. But they both knew that this was far from over. "Are you sure we're ready for this?" Ward asked, his voice tense, his hands still trembling from the recent battle. He glanced around at the reactor core. The damage was significant, and the clock was ticking. They had managed to hold off the intruders, but they were just a distraction, an obstacle in a much larger scheme. Lyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood near the damaged reactor, her eyes narrowing as she examined the diagnostics. She had spent years in combat and sabotage, but this was different. The sabotage on the Vanguard was bigger than any single mission, and she could feel it. "Trust me," she said at last, her voice steady. "We've got one chance, but we need to get to the main control room. The core's stabilization depends on rerouting the remaining power to the auxiliary grid. If we don't do this in the next 10 minutes, it'll be too late." Ward nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. He didn't have time to question her now. They didn't have the luxury. As they moved through the darkened hallways, the ship felt eerily quiet, like a ticking bomb waiting to explode. The emergency lights cast long shadows, and the air smelled faintly of burning metal and ozone. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the hallways as they sprinted toward the control room. It felt as if the entire ship was alive, shaking with the damage inflicted by the saboteurs. They were running out of time. "Where are the others?" Ward asked, his voice tight as they neared the control room. "They're either dead or locked down in their quarters," Lyra answered grimly, glancing over her shoulder. "We're on our own now." Ward's heart pounded. He knew what that meant. They couldn't wait for backup. They had to do this by themselves. As they reached the main control room, the door slid open with a hiss. Inside, the view screen showed the battle outside. The 3 enemy ships still hovering near the Vanguard, launching their relentless attack. Ward immediately moved to the central console, his hands flying over the controls. Lyra, as always, was a step ahead, scanning the room for threats. She moved with purpose, keeping a watchful eye on the windows to the outside space. It was clear to Ward now that Lyra was not just trying to save herself. She was in this for something bigger. And despite the betrayal, something in her eyes told him that she wasn't finished with her own personal war. "We're running out of time," Ward muttered as he worked to stabilize the ship's systems. "You don't need to remind me," Lyra replied, her voice cold. "The core's still unstable. We need to reroute everything, or we're done for." Ward's hands moved faster. He could feel the sweat on his brow, his heartbeat loud in his ears. The reactor was ticking down, the power surges unstable. They were dangerously close to a total meltdown, and it would only take one wrong move. "Give me a minute," Ward said, his voice tense. "I need to bypass the secondary power grid and force it through the main bypass. That should stabilize the core long enough for us to escape." He barely heard her response, as he was already deep into the programming. The numbers and symbols on the console flashed in front of him, and he worked quickly, adjusting the flow of power through the damaged systems. He needed the energy to redirect into the auxiliary grid, but it wasn't going to be easy. One misstep, and everything would collapse. Lyra, standing behind him, watched the countdown clock on the control panel, her eyes never leaving the numbers ticking away. Hurry. If we don't stop it now, we're done. Suddenly, a deep mechanical sound rang out from the far end of the control room, followed by a loud crash. Ward whipped around, his heart in his throat, just in time to see a squad of heavily armed soldiers charging through the breach in the wall. "We're not alone," Lyra hissed, her voice low. Ward barely had time to react before Lyra was already in motion. She drew her blaster, her body moving like a blur as she fired several quick shots, taking down 2 of the soldiers in the first moments. But there were more, too many for them to handle alone. Ward's mind raced. He had to finish the override. There was no time to fight. "Lyra, hold them off. I'm almost there," Ward shouted, his hands flying over the controls, working furiously to keep the systems online. The countdown clock continued to tick down with deadly accuracy, each second bringing them closer to disaster. Lyra didn't hesitate. She moved swiftly, fluidly, and with deadly precision, taking out the remaining attackers. The sound of blaster fire filled the air, and Ward knew that this was their last chance. There was no way out unless they finished this now. "Done," Ward shouted, finally pulling the last lever into place. The ship's systems hummed to life, the reactor stabilizing as the power began to flow through the auxiliary grid. Lyra stopped firing, her eyes locked on Ward as she took a deep breath. The ship had been saved. For now. "Nice work," she said, her voice low and strained. But there was something in her eyes now, something different. They had just been through hell together, and for the first time since the mission began, Ward felt like they had finally become something more than just 2 people caught in a deadly game. He nodded, trying to keep his emotions in check. "We're not out of the woods yet. The enemy's still out there. We need to take care of them." Lyra moved toward the window, her gaze scanning the enemy fleet. Her hand was already resting on her blaster, the cool determination in her eyes unmistakable. "Let's finish this," she said simply. Ward followed her, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. They had a job to do, and now it was time to end it. Together, they stepped out into the chaos once again. The final showdown had arrived, and no matter how dangerous it got, they were in this until the very end. A new beginning. The Vanguard had been through hell, and it was still standing. The ship's systems were stabilizing, the damage from the battle slowly being repaired, but the cost had been high. Ward and Lyra stood together, watching the dark expanse of space outside the viewports, the sounds of the ship's engines slowly returning to a hum of stability. Their fight wasn't over yet. The enemy fleet was still out there, but the tide had shifted. They had saved the reactor. They had thwarted the sabotage, and now they had a chance to turn the tables. Ward glanced at Lyra, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. The sabotage, the battle, the betrayal. It all felt like a dream, but the scars of it were real. He still didn't fully understand what had motivated Lyra or why she'd been sent to sabotage the mission in the first place. But something had shifted between them, something deeper than either of them had expected. "All systems are coming back online," Ward said, his voice steady. "We've secured the core, and the ship's engines are coming back online. We're not in danger of a meltdown anymore." Lyra nodded, but her gaze was far away. She wasn't focused on the ship's recovery. She was thinking about something else. The battle they had fought together, the decisions she had made. Everything had changed in a single moment. Her eyes met Ward's, and for the first time, she saw something in his expression that wasn't suspicion or anger. There was a glimmer of understanding, maybe even a hint of forgiveness. "Thank you," Lyra said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than any apology could. She wasn't one for vulnerability. But she meant it. I never expected you to trust me after everything. But you did. And for that, I'm grateful. Ward didn't say anything right away. He was still processing everything that had happened, still unsure of where they stood. But one thing was certain. Lyra had become more than just a mission partner. She was someone who had saved the ship, someone who had fought with him when everything seemed lost. And in a strange way, they had both learned something about themselves. "Just doing my job," Ward said, his voice a little softer than usual. He turned back to the command console. "We still have one more problem. The enemy fleet is still out there, and if we don't act now, we're sitting ducks." Lyra's eyes hardened once again, her focus shifting back to the immediate threat. "I know what to do." The two of them worked together in perfect harmony, using the ship's tactical systems to assess the enemy fleet. The ships were large, heavily armed, and they had already proven their ability to break through the Vanguard's defenses. But now, with the ship's engines back online, and the weapons systems restored, they had a fighting chance. "You've got the schematics?" Ward asked as he mapped out their battle strategy. Lyra nodded, already calculating their next move. "I've already been in touch with the tactical team. We'll hit them with everything we've got." As the battle raged outside, the Vanguard prepared for its final confrontation with the enemy fleet. Ward and Lyra stood side by side, their bond stronger than ever. They had fought together, survived together, and now they would face their enemies together. In the command room, the countdown clock was ticking down. The time to strike had come. The Vanguard's weapons systems fired with precision, launching a barrage of energy blasts at the enemy ships. The blast shields held up as the enemy retaliated, but the Vanguard was ready. They were no longer reacting to the attack. They were taking control of the fight. Ward watched as Lyra coordinated with the crew, directing them to strike at the enemy's weak points, forcing the attackers to retreat. The energy from their engines powered up with each successful strike. And then, with one final, calculated move, they launched a series of ion blasts that disabled the enemy fleet's central command ship. The remaining ships scattered, their communications severed, leaving them vulnerable to the Vanguard's firepower. "It's over," Ward said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and exhaustion. Lyra gave him a small, satisfied smile. "For now. But there's still a lot of work to be done." As the ship's systems began to settle, the tension that had held them both in a constant state of alertness slowly faded. The battle was won, but the journey wasn't over. Ward knew that whatever lay ahead, he wasn't going to face it alone. "You've done more than your share, Lieutenant," Ward said, offering a rare grin. "Maybe it's time we figure out what's next." Lyra didn't immediately respond. Instead, she looked out the viewport, watching the remnants of the battle fading into the distance. "I don't know," she said after a pause, her voice thoughtful. "But maybe it's time for something new, something that doesn't involve all the chaos and lies." Ward raised an eyebrow. "A new beginning, huh?" Lyra looked at him, a flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe a hint of a future neither of them had expected, dancing in her eyes. "Yeah, a new beginning." With that, the two of them stood in the quiet of the command room, the hum of the Vanguard systems, the only sound between them. The war was over for now, but the galaxy was vast, and with each other at their side, there were endless possibilities ahead. Whatever came next, they were ready to face it together. As the Vanguard drifted away from the wreckage of the battle, heading toward an uncertain future, Ward knew one thing for certain. They had fought hard, survived together, and now they had the chance to make their own destiny.